There's not like that rush, like the professor the big reveal. Good to see you.
Yes. It's more than that. Good morning. I'm Kimberly Adams, a member of the Board of Governors at the National Press Club and a correspondent for Marketplace. This morning, I welcome back to the podium the senior senator from Ohio, Sherrod Brown. Senator Brown, first elected to the U.S. Senate in 2006 after 7 terms representing Ohio in the U.S. House of Representatives, has focused his life in public service to fighting for what he calls the dignity of work, the belief that hard work should pay off for everyone, no matter who you are or what you do. As the ranking member on the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee during the 2017 tax debate, and again through legislation introduced earlier this year, he has pushed for corporations to put more money in the pockets of their workers. He has called for giving tax incentives to businesses that make their products in America, pay higher wages, provide sick leave, offer health and retirement benefits, and employ veterans. Conversely, he has opposed the phenomenon that some call short-termism, when a company's primary goal is to increase stock prices for near-term market benefits rather than focus on the long-term success of the firm and its workers. Many publicly traded companies pursue this strategy by repurchasing their own stocks. These purchases, called stock buybacks, can increase the share price, improving returns for executives and other investors who hold stock. A report just yesterday from CNN Business said S&P 500 companies are on track to buy back $940 billion worth of stock in 2019, surpassing the record buybacks in 2018 following the implementation of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. While the corporate tax cut freed up corporate revenues for some of these buybacks, CNN reports some of this year's buybacks are being financed by debt in this low interest rate environment, concerning some market analysts. The senator will focus his remarks today on the increasing use of stock buybacks to boost stock prices and new legislation he will introduce that he says will help workers claim a greater share of a company's profits. But of course, the most important thing to know about Senator Brown is that he's very well connected. His wife, Connie Schultz, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and columnist. Before I turn the microphone over to Senator Brown, let me remind you that following his remarks, we will take questions from members of the news media along with members of the National Press Club. Reporters outside Washington who are watching via the live stream may submit questions by emailing them to questions@press.org. Finally, I thank Jamie Horowitz of the Headliners Committee for organizing today's Newsmaker. Now, please join me in welcoming Senator Brown to the National Press Club. Senator.
Ms. Adams, thank you. And Jamie, wherever Jamie went, thank you. Jamie, good to see you. Thanks. It's an honor to be at the Press Club always. I celebrate what you do for our country and this institution in spite of attacks from people that ought to know better or do know better. So thank you all for being part of a great American institution of journalism. American workers work longer and harder than ever before, but have little to show for it. Stock prices soar, executive compensation has exploded, productivity of workers goes up, but wages are largely flat. This isn't a coincidence. It's not an accident of the market. It's not an inevitable result of capitalism. It's by Wall Street's explicit design. Wall Street's obsession with accumulating wealth for the people who already have it comes at the direct expense of American workers, all workers. We need to reorient our economy from Wall Street greed to the dignity of work. Today, I'm rolling out a plan to put workers back into the equation, and make clear to corporate executives, if you want to line your own pockets, you better make sure your workers are sharing in the profits that they created for you. We take pride in hard work in this country. We believe that work has value, no matter who you are or what kind of work you do. But we know that for far too many people, hard work simply isn't paying off. And instead of fighting for workers, the President of the United States has betrayed workers. He stokes fears. He places blame. He points the finger at immigrants, mothers and fathers who just want the same things that all of us in this room want for our children, the opportunity to work hard and to make a better life for our kids. He attacks African American leaders. He pits American communities against each other by insulting predominantly African American cities like Baltimore. He divides Americans with his border wall and his racist attacks to distract from the fact that his cronies on Wall Street are rigging the system to take the profits for themselves. His tax bill was a big part of that. We know most people in the country work hard. They pay their fair share. The fact is, it's corporations who are not paying their fair share. America is one of the richest countries on earth. Our corporations are prospering. Wall Street is doing even better. There's no reason other than corporate greed that workers cannot share in the wealth that they are creating. Corporate greed is fundamental to the Wall Street business model. We know that. Workers aren't going to get their fair share until we change it. We know that too. Wall Street and Main Street's interests no longer match. Companies used to consider themselves as having multiple stakeholders: their workers, their customers, their communities, their workers, their customers, their shareholders, the surrounding community. But in the 1980s, all that changed. Greed was good. A new school of economic thinking of economists pushed the idea that corporate executives had one and only one job: increasing share prices, which not surprisingly also meant executives lining their own pockets. Executives in the corporate boardroom no longer consider what's in the long-term interests of their workers, of small-time investors, of the American economy. To them, workers are nothing more than a line item in a budget, a cost to be minimized. When companies raise wages, Wall Street punishes them. When companies lay off workers, Wall Street rewards them. Think about that for a second. When companies raise wages, Wall Street punishes them. When companies lay off workers, Wall Street rewards them. Corporate executives focus on short-term performance in the stock market, even when that comes at the expense of the long-term success of the company, its workers, and our economy overall. Their main goal is to increase stock prices quarter to quarter. That's how CEO performance is evaluated, compensated in large part with company shares. Increasingly, corporations now juice those stock prices by repurchasing their own stock. We call those stock buybacks. Depending on the size of the company, stocks can account for half of an executive's compensation package, in some cases even more than that. And of course, executives' personal interests influence their decision-making. One study of some 2,500 companies found that the greater the percentage of stock options in executive compensation packages, the more likely a company was to do stock buybacks. I'll say that again. The greater the percentage of stock options in executive compensation packages, the more likely a company was to do stock buybacks. We shouldn't be surprised then when President Trump and Leader McConnell handed them a windfall with the 2017 tax law. Those executives turned around and plowed that money right back into stock buybacks, and much of that money ended up in their own pockets. McConnell and Trump weren't surprised either. They knew exactly what they were doing. Remember the promises President Trump made during the lead up to the tax bill. His tax law would mean raises for workers. He said it over and over. He promised that somehow these more massive tax cuts, corporate tax cuts, would end up in workers' pockets. I heard him in a meeting in the cabinet room. I heard him pledge to a group of senators that every American would get a $4,000 raise. He told workers last year, the month after he signed the law, you're all going to start seeing a lot more money in your paychecks. One lie after another. Last year, following the Trump tax cut, companies spent $1.5 million every minute of every hour of every day, 365 days. Every minute of every hour of every day, companies spent $1.5 million on stock buybacks. We've seen companies spend as much as 100% of their profits on their own stocks instead of capital improvements, instead of workers' wages. Atlantic called this the stock buyback swindle. America needs to say stop. I'm introducing a plan to ensure that workers share in the wealth they create and limit stock buybacks significantly. Some have suggested we ban buybacks. Okay, I'm okay with that. But we all know that corporations and sort of a whack-a-mole, corporations will find other ways to enrich their shareholders. My goal is singularly, I want to put more money in the pockets of workers. The goal of any stock buyback proposal should be helping American workers get their fair share. It's why I'm proposing this worker dividend. The proposal is simple. If corporations want to transfer wealth to Wall Street, workers have to get a proportionate share of that wealth. For every $1 million passed on to shareholders in the form of stock buybacks or increased dividends, corporations will pass on $1 to every worker. For every $1 million passed on to shareholders in the form of stock buybacks or increased dividends, corporations will have to pass on $1 to every employee, every worker. We're calling it a worker dividend. All public corporations will be required to pay it. If you work at a big company, you can go online right now to brown.senate.gov, calculate how much your employer would owe you under any plan. This one I will talk about in a moment. $20 billion stock buybacks, every worker gets $20,000. Big banks have some of the worst stock buyback offenders or some of the best beneficiaries, say how you want. So let's look at the example of J.P. Morgan Chase, a company, I believe Ohio has the second most J.P. Morgan Chase employees of any state in the country. They bought back approximately $20 billion of their own stock last year. We have a spreadsheet where you can look up the 20 largest companies, starting, I believe, with Apple at tens of billions of dollars in stock buybacks. You can enter the total amount your employer spent on stock buybacks last year, and then you simply hit calculate. You find out that if you're a bank teller at a local branch of J.P. Morgan Chase, they will owe you $20,000. That worker dividend would be long overdue for the bank's 21,000 Ohio workers at J.P. Morgan Chase, all of them vital to the bank's success. Think about this. The entry level of a J.P. Morgan Chase teller is about $35,000. You can't support a family on that. Compare that to the $31 million the bank paid its CEO last year. I know the C-suite crowd will say companies like Walmart have more than 2 million employees. It can't afford to pay a worker dividend to all of its workers. They'll lay people off. Prices will go up. You know, it's funny, or really it's not so funny. When Walmart spent $8 billion in stock buybacks that line executives' pockets, I didn't hear anyone complaining that their prices might go up. When they were handing out executive bonuses, I didn't hear anyone wringing their hands about layoffs. And you expect Americans to believe that asking corporations to just share $1 with workers for every million they spend on themselves is too much? If Walmart wants to avoid paying the worker dividend, the solution is pretty simple. Don't do $8 billion in stock buybacks. Instead, invest that money in raising workers' wages, establishing on-the-job training programs, making capital investments. But if you choose to do stock buybacks, pay workers their fair share. Again, $1 to every worker for every $1 million in stock buybacks. It comes down to the dignity of work. Wall Street simply doesn't recognize that all work has dignity, but we know the workers at J.P. Morgan or Walmart are every bit as responsible for their success as the executives are. Wall Street considers shareholders' equity in a company to be all that matters. But workers have equity in a company too, sweat equity. It's time workers are rewarded for it. I'll take questions.
All right, I'll take the prerogative and get started. What are the chances of this becoming law in our current congressional environment as well as with the president sitting in the White House?
Like a lot of, like a new idea, a new big idea, it takes a while for it to be discussed and understood, and its ramifications known. I would go back to, so, I mean, it's not going to pass this week, it's not going to pass this month, but I go back to when we, back in 2013, 14, and 15, when I had launched a major effort to expand the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, and with a Republican House, a Republican Senate, a Democratic president, and nobody thought it had a chance. And we worked it. We got President Obama to threaten a veto on another tax bill. We began the mantra: no corporate tax cuts, no corporate tax extenders passed until the ITC, until workers got a raise, got the tax cut, and over about a 2-year period, we enacted the law. We're doing the same thing. We hope to do the same thing on this.
This came up, the issue of sort of corporations, quote unquote, raiding the American economy came up in the debate last night. Is this sort of anti-corporate message a good message for Democrats heading into 2020, both in the presidential and congressional races?
My message is not anti-corporate. My message is pro-worker. And I think when you talk about the dignity of work, it's not just a slogan. It's how our candidate for president, whoever she is or he is, will be elected. It's how you should campaign. It's who we are, and it's how we should govern. And if we govern through the eyes of workers, understanding, honoring work, respecting work, the dignity of work, it will mean issues like this will pass, perhaps that you mentioned in the introduction, the corporate freeloader fee, the Patriot Corporation Act, restoring the overtime rule that this president has emasculated, and his new labor secretary will weaken even more, presumably. We start governing that way. It's not a question of anti-corporate. I mean, frankly, if workers are treated better, companies do better. There's more buying power. There's less turnover. There are workers, if some of these dollars end up going into training instead of stock buybacks and investing in the company, we all do better.
But there is really strong language, both what you've said today as well as what we heard last night on the Democratic debate stage, that many of the problems facing America's workers are due to corporations effectively taking what you're saying and what some of the candidates are saying should belong to workers. Is that the message that you think is going to resonate with Democratic voters?
Again, I appreciate your observation that way, but I think, again, if the message is more about workers and much of what was discussed, and I didn't watch the whole debate, but much of what was discussed last night is how Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump have betrayed workers, that it's government actions. It is certainly corporate greed. I used that term a number of times in this short speech, but it's also government. It's Mitch McConnell enabling them, refusing to pass a minimum wage, refusing to step in on the overtime rule, refusing the president refusing to put forward judges who actually are pro-worker, instead judges that put their thumb on the scales of justice to support corporations over workers and Wall Street over consumers and interest groups over voting rights. I mean, it's all of that. But ultimately, it rests with us to formulate a pro-worker message and to govern that way next year.
Before we turn it to the audience for questions, a question from Mark Hamrick of Bankrate.com, who's a former press club president. Everyone's waiting on the Fed today, and they are broadly expected to cut interest rates. Have Jerome Powell and the rest of the Fed caved to President Trump's pressure for a rate cut?
I don't know. I don't know if I've talked to Chairman Powell a number of times. I can't speak to his motives or ideas. I think that he believes the Fed should be independent. The president has no more respect for the Fed than he does the National Press Club. But I do think that they operate independently, and I accept that as an independent, and I don't have much advice for what he should do.
All right, questions from the audience? Yes, we have a microphone if you just wait a moment. Oh,
I'm pretty loud.
okay. Him first, and then we'll go to you, ma'am.
Sorry, Sabrina. Think
Sorry,
you call me
Sabrina.
Cleveland person
Sabrina can go
first.
first if you want.
So go ahead.
But there are lot few. Oh, hi, Jim Saxa, CQ roll call. There are a lot fewer public companies today than there were just 20 years ago, about half. If you pass this, won't this discourage companies from going public and mean less transparency in the markets and fewer opportunities for mom and pop investors to be involved?
I don't know why this would mean fewer companies would go public. Those decisions about companies going public or after they're public to go the other way are considered. There's so many considerations for making that decision. I can't imagine this would be a major consideration for them to go public or not. So I am concerned, as you are, about the smaller number of companies, the smaller number of farms, the smaller number of small retail of bookstores in Cleveland. I mean, all of those things. So I just don't see this as having that kind. I think it will change corporate behavior. Not to go public or not, but it'll change corporate behavior in some cases when they don't want to have to put that much money into their workforce in order to get the stock buybacks, but then they will take those profits and will spend them somewhere. They can't do it in dividends because our bill's covered by that. So they need to make a decision where are they going to invest those profits, and they will invest them in growing their business or they invest them in workers. Did you want to follow? Okay.
Yeah, can I do a follow-up? Some people, you cover dividends as well, and you cover dividends as well. Some people argue that stock buybacks are just a more efficient way of passing along profits to the owners of the company. This seems to really, though, like you don't think this would disincentivize the ability for the company to pay back the people that ultimately own it, and you don't think that would have any impact at all on whether or not they would decide to go public or keep their company private?
I don't think it would have a significant impact on that. There are so many other market forces that have shrunk the number of companies in terms of mergers and acquisitions and all that. I think that I guess when I think about what's happened in this country in the last 20 years, where corporate profits are up, executive compensation. You've seen the numbers. I can't update them exactly, but 30 years ago, roughly, CEO paid, average worker pay was 40 to 1, maybe something like that. Today, it's 200, 300, 400 to 1, depending on how you measure it. Maybe you think that, from the tone of your question, that, and maybe certainly Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump, I'm not saying you do, but Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump think that you just can't give enough to corporations, you can't give enough to rich people, but I think our society doesn't particularly think that way, and workers have been squeezed. There's a reason worker wages have not gone up. Stock prices go up, compensation goes up, profits go up, workers are more and more productive and their wages are flat. And to me, I didn't come to the Senate to help corporations make more money. I came to the Senate to help workers get better pay, and corporations making money is fine with me, but not just for their stockholders. When we used to look at a company as serving its shareholders, its stakeholders, and that's the community and the families and the workers and the customers.
Hi, Senator. Do you have a House counterpart for this?
Not yet.
Are you?
We will. We will have some co-sponsors. We are not planning to do. Sometimes I introduce bills and look for a large number of co-sponsors. Other times we'll do one Democrat then one Republican. And other times I'll look at working the House at the same time. We are just introducing this, and those steps come later.
Do you have any co-sponsors in the Senate?
A couple of people have shown interest, but most of my colleagues don't know much about this bill yet.
Hi, Senator. I'm Marty LeClaire. I write a blog for Forbes, but I'm actually a professional money manager. And I agree with you. I think one of the big problems is these business schools, particularly the elite business schools, have said that these corporations have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize profits, which kind of elevates it to this ridiculous
It's in the
sphere.
Constitution somewhere, right?
Yeah. But my question is this: why $1 per million of buyback, as opposed to saying, okay, if you're going to buy back $1 billion worth of shares, 20% or 5% or 30% has to go to the workers' pool? Why did you do it that
We
way?
looked at a lot of different ways of doing it. This is based in large part on the UAW profit sharing plan, where $1 million of profit, every worker gets $1. And when we saw what this came out to, so a company like Walmart is $8 billion in stock buybacks, every worker would get $8,000. That sounded pretty reasonable, especially in a company where a worker, $8,000 when Walmart workers, many of them start at $30,000 a year, even full-time workers. So we thought that number just sounded fair. I am, of course, but I just think the simplicity of $1 million in stock buybacks, they can afford $1 per worker.
So just a follow-up.
Sure.
As a percentage, roughly what is it then? Ballpark as a percentage.
Well, it changes from company to company, because it changes from company to company in stock. But so we are, because we don't know what a company's going to do with stock buybacks, it will be very different in very different companies. So I'm open always to discussing some of those numbers, but I just think much of passing a bill in Congress, as you know, is making it simple in a way that the media can report it and members of Congress with all our limitations can understand it.
Just a reminder that people who are watching the live stream, if you have questions, you can email those to questions@press.org. And I believe we have a question here in the back.
Okay, Carol James, Independent. I wonder if you considered going along with this stream of discussion, attributing these buybacks, actually just taking a proportion of shares and making those shares owned by each individual worker, or conversely creating something like a worker cooperative, which would then be given these shares and the workers can control them, something structural.
Yeah, we thought about all of those, and really the same answer to his, in some sense, that this is simple, it's clean, it's money in their pockets, that it will be enforced by SEC. It will be determined and enforced by SEC based on the dollar stock buybacks and the calculation. The money will be paid out in the first quarter of the year, so workers can then do what they want. I didn't want to get into shareholders, and I think workers, again, it's just simpler that the workers get direct dollars, and they want to buy company stock, they can. If they want to buy a car, they can. If they want to do something else, they can.
Lon from CNBC. Do you have a limit on what workers would qualify for receiving the worker dividend? Would the EVP making $500,000 a year at JP Morgan also qualify for the worker dividend as well? And then also, can you talk about some of the new transparency or disclosure requirements that might be a part of this bill as well?
Okay. First is all workers will qualify that weren't the executives getting stock buybacks. Obviously, workers that get stock buybacks, the executives don't qualify. All other workers do, including some workers that might make $200,000 a year would get the $8,000 at Walmart or the $22,000, the $20,000 at JP Morgan Chase. And our definition is expansive, in that if companies do, if they contract out work, if they classify workers differently, they all will be eligible, because we want to make sure that companies don't use this as a way to sort of shed their workforce to avoid paying this. Second part of the question, I'm sorry, is? Disclosure. We are tightening up the rules on stock buybacks, so they're one, simpler, second, more transparent, and third, stricter in terms of how often they can do stock buybacks and how they can do it, and disclosure and transparency will be part of that.
With Politico. Say it takes a while for Congress to pass this bill, but maybe Democrats take back the White House. Have you thought about anything administratively the next president could do to address your concerns about stock buybacks?
We have not really. I know that Senator Baldwin has a bill on prohibiting stock buybacks. So there is interest among a number of people. I would assume some of the presidential candidates will start talking more about stock buybacks. Some, I think, have a little bit. I don't yet know if there are ways, we haven't really explored that administratively, but the launch of this bill and the fact that I'm going to talk about this a lot, similar to our Dignity of Work message earlier in the year, and similar to the ITC CTC successful effort of 3 and 4 and 5 years ago, this will, we hope, continue to get more attention. I mean, I want our presidential candidates to talk more about the dignity of work. Some of them are doing it well. Some use that term, some don't. I don't care if they use the term, but are talking about governing through the eyes of workers. This will be one part of that, and I'm hopeful that come 2021, that what happens in the elections and what happens as the public and elected officials know more and more about proposals like this with stock buybacks, that we will find ways.
Can you talk more about how you're going to try to sell this bill? What your next steps are to get the word out? Are you going to talk to the 2020 candidates?
Yeah,
about
I will tell you,
this up?
I talk to them. I mean, they're not at work every day, as you may know. But I talk to them pretty frequently about all this kind of stuff. And our staffs are pretty close. My staff's not, Nora and others of my staff aren't close to the presidential candidate advisors, but to their office people. And so we will continue to do that.
Thank you. Hi, Hazel Bradford with Pensions and Investments. You just say the SEC would enforce it. Have you talked to them about that? How much would they have to build and enforce
Oh,
it?
they don't have to do much. I mean, they already know that. I got these numbers from, I guess we get them from SEC, the stock buyback numbers. So the numbers are available, and the calculation's pretty simple. $1 per million, 20 billion is 20,000. So that shouldn't be complicated. Then the next question is, how many employees do you have? The SEC enforcement, probably biggest challenge is that some corporations would try to hide the number of employees based on all kinds of sleights of hand. I think they would pay a price with, we still have a free media in this country. And I think this is something a lot of local media national media would like to weigh on, and local media, if a company is hiding 300 employees under to get these kinds of checks, I think the local newspaper and local TV and radio stations and bloggers would enjoy unearthing that sleight of hand by a corporation. But it's up to the government to enforce it, I understand, but I think there are ways.
But not the dividend piece, the new controls, the limits on buyback practices, because you're talking about excessive. Who defines excessive?
Well, there's no excessive. There is the frequency at which they're bought back. That has a lot to do with manipulation of stock prices, and the SEC already does some of that. I mean, there are rules now, so it would continue. We will sit down with them, and I think my staff has spoken to them in some detail, Alicia and our staff. But we will follow through on that.
So you wouldn't be building a new
No, I
enforcement
don't think
system?
I don't think it's that complicated. I don't think the change doesn't complicate it more.
Thank you. Bianca Ficini from Newsy. I'm wondering, were there any particular companies you had in mind when you were writing this legislation?
No, just yes, in the sense that we saw the gargantuan sum of stockbacks. It's more that the numbers that Ms. Adams mentioned in the introduction, that this year set records for stock buybacks. You said 800 or 900 billion? I think 900.
Goldman Sachs, according to CNN, said they're on track for $940 billion in stock buybacks this year, surpassing last year.
Yeah, so every year, and I think 18 succeeded 17. So it was the stock buyback, the corporate tax cut juiced this. The number won't keep going up as dramatically. It's gone up the last 3 years, but it will keep going up. So I just look at the size of these stock buybacks and how I know that the 1% are getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, and most of the rest of the country So wages and compensation are flat. So this wasn't aimed at any one company. This is aimed at the workers for those companies. And we have, I think, on our website, the 20 largest stock buyback examples. We will continue to collect more of that.
And do you share the fear that some people have that the rate of buybacks that we're seeing could contribute to another recession soon?
I think the rate of buybacks where executives continue to take more and more and more for themselves is an attack ultimately on the social fabric of our country. So I think it has all kinds of potential for upheaval for our economy, for civil order, for all of those kinds of things. And people feel increasingly the system's rigged against them. And these stock buybacks are one of the most in-your-face examples, I think.
Thank you.
Caitlin Riley from CQ Roll Call. You highlighted JP Morgan, Chase, and Walmart in your remarks. I was wondering whether you had a sense of how much the worker dividend would have been total at those companies if they were buying back stock at the levels that they are.
Well, the number, the $20,000 is what JP Morgan Chase did last year. The $8 billion, therefore 8,000 was what Walmart did last year. I have no idea what they're doing this year. We'll find out. But it will be a significant amount of money for a Walmart greeter or cashier and a JP Morgan bank teller. I was my high school reunion in Mansfield, Ohio, 5 years ago. And I sat across, my class was 400 people. I sat across from a woman who said she's worked at JP Morgan Chase for 30 years. She's a bank teller and she's making $30,000 a year after 30 year. So JP Morgan Chase has raised their minimum wage in part from hectoring from a lot of us on the banking committee. But these are the two companies I mentioned today are two of the largest employers in Ohio. I believe Walmart's Ohio's largest employer. I think Walmart's the largest employer in a couple dozen, I'm not sure of that, but in a lot of places. I believe Walmart's the largest number of employees in Ohio. I mean, our largest employer in JP Morgan Chase with 21,000 and 17,000 of those in the Columbus area is certainly one of the biggest employers in the state too.
Mm-hmm. And then based on last year's stock buyback numbers, do you have a sense if a worker dividend had been in place then, how much the worker dividend would have cost each of those companies?
You could do the math if Walmart has 2.1 million employees, which I think is the number, and you could multiply that by 8,000, and you'd have, is that 16 billion, right? 16.8 billion, roughly, if my math's right. Help me, somebody. Okay, it's hard to stand up here and do math, okay. Finance guy, is that right? Okay. And so JP Morgan Chase, I don't know how many employees total they have. They have 21,000 in Ohio, and and that's a lot of money for those employees. It's a lot of money coming into Central Ohio.
But it's coming out of shareholder money, right? Comes out of the dividend.
Well, it comes from somewhere.
Yeah.
Comes a lot from those executives too.
Well, I mean, to echo that point, many shareholders are pension funds or retirees. People hold 401ks, even though many Americans do not have those investments. But some of this money that you're talking about directing to the workers of these companies would indeed be coming from people who might also be those same workers. As in if you own in your own company stock in your 401k program.
I'm thinking the workers will do better and management will make a little bit less money than they've been making. But when the larger pension funds are a part of this, but the larger pension funds will not take that big a hit. I mean, they don't have to do the stock buybacks. Again, we figure from this bill, if it were enacted, there would probably be fewer stock buybacks, but it'd be management's decision, and then that money would go into worker training, maybe higher ed programs for workers. It would go to build the business. It would go to buying new equipment. It would be to all those things. I mean, it's not taking money and putting it in a place that doesn't work for the economy.
And just to follow up on the Walmart example, I think if you said Walmart spent something like $8 billion, right, on buybacks, it has 2 million workers. In that case, the worker dividend would exceed the amount of the stock buyback.
it would in a company like that, correct.
Because they have so many workers, and that's part of the point of the bill. Or
but
would
look at
there be a
look-
cap?
Yeah, no, there is no cap. I mean, then if that's too much for them to pay, then they don't. But I go back to what I said when one of the curious, it's not curious, is that what I was saying earlier wasn't funny, that whenever there's a minimum wage bill in Congress, corporate America always says, oh, if we raise the minimum wage, people will get laid off and prices will go up. But they never, ever say that when corporate executives get seven-figure bonuses, ever. It's never going to, it won't give some executive a $2 million bonus. That's not going to raise prices. That's not going to cause layoffs, but give a minimum wage worker an extra $1 an hour, and it does. So it's where you stand on this. It's what we think is better for our society. And when corporate executives are making this kind of money and workers don't get raises, we should do something bold that works for the economy and empowers workers. And in the end, the economy will be better because workers. I don't think if my guess is most Walmart workers that get $8,000 aren't putting the money aren't investing, aren't putting the money in a Swiss bank account. They're spending it in their communities. Probably not going to buy Libra currency either. But I mean, the money will be spent locally and will stimulate the economy locally. That's the way that our economy, in our best years in our economy, the best years have been when worker wages are good and they're spending the money that they make and can save a little bit.
I'm Lorna Aldrich, member of the Press Club. And one of the big trends in the economy now, which is what some people think explains the plateau in wages, is the rise of automation. And particularly for a company like Walmart, if they were given such a hit, have you thought about the effect this might have on automation? And of course, as we all know, most of us don't deal with tellers anymore. We deal with the ATM machines. So this could have some effect on the already strong trend toward automation.
We'll go to banks and tellers. Without this bill, we see what banks are eliminating tellers mostly. When I talk about the 21,000 employees that J.P. Morgan Chase has in mostly Central Ohio, but in my state overall, very few of them relatively are tellers. But they're an easy job to understand. We all have dealt with tellers before. We know they're underpaid. We know they have to spend a little more money on clothes than many people because they've got to look good because they come to work and they deal with customers and all the kinds of expenses that tellers have. So we know who they are. So I use them as an example. I can use back office people where the companies are always going to want to minimize recent behavior, and automation is 30, 40, 50 years, whatever of it. They've always the companies increasingly try to minimize their costs, and that workers are a cost to be minimized. This bill doesn't change that. I just want those millions of workers that have been undervalued to share in the wealth they create.
All right, I'll take the last question for myself. You mentioned earlier that companies often find ways around these types of restrictions, hiding their number of employees, other maneuvers. What protections have you written into this legislation to stop companies from avoiding having to pay these dividends to workers if they do want to do large stock buybacks?
Well, we're expanding the definition of worker by talking about contracted out work, by talking about those workers who are classified in different ways that are part-time, we will, if they're part-time, we will prorate and do all that. So part of it is that workers, we know that some companies will play those games. Most companies will, I think, play it straight. But there are absolute ways of enforcing this and making sure that the broad swath of workers get what's due to them.
Senator Brown, thank you
Thank
so
you all.
much. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
And of course, our traditional gift, you get the Press Club mug. Hey, you have to pose for the picture.
Picture of the Press Club mug.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, good to see you. Thanks. Thanks, thank you. Figured you would. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for coming. So how's the Wexner story? It's just- I think they've played it straight.